Happy Halloween. Bob, dare boldly is what I say, so I appreciate what you said earlier. Although I don't know about you, but in my experience, saying Happy Halloween is an odd thing to hear in church. It's an odd thing to say in church, for that matter. Halloween, gets a bad rap among some Christians, but it has surprisingly close connections to Christianity. Early on, you see, Christians celebrated what we now call All Saints' Day, which, by the way, is tomorrow, November 1st. These early Christians were already celebrating feast days of faithful people, the saints, as Paul calls them, these faithful people who had died, such as martyrs and other famous Christians who had died. But then they began celebrating what they called All Saints' Day, as a celebration of all who had died in faith, both the known as well as the unknown, taking seriously that passage in Hebrews 11 that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. In older English, another term for a saint or a holy person was a hallowed, or a hallow rather, as in hallowed be thy name. And so they called, in England at least, this day All Hallows Day. And the day before it was, of course, All Hallows Eve, or All Hallows, or Hallows Even, or Halloween. I won't go into how we got to costumes and candy and pumpkins. That's another story entirely. Halloween, I will say, though, is an odd mix. And I don't just mean candy corns and peanuts. In Halloween, we get both signs of death in the midst of life, as well as life in the midst of death, like children dressed up like skeletons, or flowers in the cemetery. Sometimes the Christian life itself is just as odd of a mix. We wear crosses on our living bodies, and we face death with the hope of new life. Our text this morning, which comes from John 11, is an odd mix as well. Listen to what it says, and read with me either here on the screen or in your Bibles, either physical or digital. Hear the word of the Lord. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, there's some backstory here that I'll get to in just a moment, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother Lazarus would not have died." And when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews, the crowd of other Judeans who came with her also weeping, he himself was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Some translations add that there's a hint of anger in the way in which he is moved. And Jesus said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus began to weep. And so the Jews said, "See how he loved him being Lazarus." But some of them also said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave. A stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he's been dead 4 days." And Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" And so they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." This story, of course, comes on the heels of several things. One of them is Jesus giving sight to a blind man, as is referenced in this story. He also talks about himself, about how he is the good shepherd, and how the sheep know the good shepherd's voice. He also, at the beginning of chapter 11, hears that Lazarus is sick, but he waits a couple of days, and the text kind of leaves that question hanging of why it is that he waits, other than saying this is so that the glory of God may be revealed. You've got a number of things going on in this passage. You've got, it starts, at least where we read, with Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, in the middle of a funeral. And it ends with a live man walking out of a tomb. There is death in the midst of life, and life in the midst of death. It's an odd mix, this passage truly is. And we can find plenty to relate to in this passage, I think. This past Monday night, those of us who were at Rooted over at Brown's Bakery read this text, and I asked people what or to whom they could relate to in this text. Some could relate to the sisters, having lost family early on in life. Corey, who was leading the study, said that he actually relates most to Lazarus, after having spent much of his youth, his teen years especially, lying in hospital beds, waiting to hear what the doctors would say this time. Others see ourselves in Jesus, weeping with those who mourn, maybe even a little bit perturbed, or in the crowd, moved but keeping our distance, not quite wanting to fully believe. Perhaps you see yourself in Martha, the realist who doesn't want to get her hopes up. And who among us has not had the same thoughts as Mary? Lord, if you had just been here, if you had just shown up in time, this would not have happened. We see ourselves in these people. We know what it's like to be them. And we can relate because we're an odd mix too, aren't we Christians? Not just with our crosses and our beliefs about the hereafter, but even the way we show up in church. I saw a photo recently of an abandoned church in the Czech Republic. Wish I'd thrown the photo in here, but hear the description for just a moment. The roof had caved in, and to raise money for repairs, an art student from the community had installed some fixtures in the church. But it's a rather interesting picture to see, and if you want to Google it sometime, just look for art ghosts in church. Because what the art student had done is he'd set up mannequins in this church and draped ragged cloths over them, so that you look out in the church and in the pews, instead of normal everyday church folks sitting there, you see what look like ghosts. Or perhaps it's a comment on how one can look out in church and see what would ordinarily be normal everyday church folks, but instead also see those who are, in a real sense, lifeless. Perfect for Halloween, isn't it? I think it's an apt image for the way that I included, sometimes show up in church, though. For many of us, life has beaten us down with so much that we might as well be traipsing in as bodiless spirits. We've seen too many families at the end of their rope, heard too many gasps in the ICU. We've had way too many hopes and dreams shattered by the blunt edges of life. Even more of us live while carrying the deaths of loved ones from COVID, and in this country, relationships squelched of life at the hands of isolation and polarization. And even ministers are not immune to this, by the way. I recently had a conversation with a guy that I went to college with who's now currently a minister. He told me about his first child, who was stillborn. He told me about the church member and friend who recently took his own life. He also told me about the new widower who, in the police station, asked him, the minister, to be the ones to tell her children. In this conversation, as he and I talked, he said verbatim, I just need Jesus to show up, which very well may have been the words of Mary and Martha at Lazarus' bedside. There isn't one of us who doesn't live with the signs of death in our lives. We come into church wrapped in funeral clothes, if not burial clothes, as if every Sunday were All Hallows' Eve. The oddest mix about all this, though, about the text that we read and about the Christian life, is that somehow, some way, God is also in the mix. The Gospel of John starts with this oddest of mixtures. The Word that was in the beginning and that was with God and that was God, quote, became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood, as the Message version puts it. This Word shows up at the funeral long after those attending think that he should have been there. He doesn't tell us why he's late. He doesn't offer Mary a theological reflection on waiting, but rather Jesus' response in the midst of death is action. Where have you laid him? Jesus asks. He wipes his eyes and walks to the tomb. Didn't you think, he says, that if you believed, didn't I tell you rather, that if you believed, you'd see the glory of God? Belief here is odd. The people standing by have seen the body. You've seen the body. You may well have seen life leave it. You may even smell it behind that rock. And yet Jesus, the Word in flesh, asks for it. And the one who called the world into being, who was there in the beginning, calls Lazarus out of the tomb, back into life, and tells those who witnessed this oddest of things to go unbind him and let him go and take off those funeral cloaks while you're at it, because this is not the place of death and confinement and lack of imagination, but rather one of life and freedom and spirit-filled, glory-revealing belief and hope. Here, Jesus does show up. Here, the promise of life rings true. So what about us in our odd mix of today? What does it look like for Jesus to show up in our lives? How is that promise true for us? Call it odd, but I think it shows up in the people who aren't here with us anymore, at least in the way that we're used to having them among us. I think there's something to the celebration of All Saints, both known and unknown, that may help us to build faith. You see, I think of several folks. I think of my great-uncle Felix, a minister and a quiet example of the peace that Jesus preached. Felix died last year of COVID, but he wasn't alone in that supposedly isolated hospital room. You see, he had around him a great cloud of witnesses, of which he is now a part, and which also surrounds me. I think of my wife's grandfather, who died of a heart attack several years ago. And I remember in the moment when she called me from the Philippines, and it was video call, and she was there in the house where his body lay, and she asked me, "Do you want to see him?" And for a moment I was jarred, and then remembered that for that context in the Philippines, the family has the body there in the house for sometimes a week at a time or more, waiting for relatives to come in, where there is death, but there is also life, in which kids run around and board games are played and people stay up all night and they're singing at 3 a.m. in celebration of life. And that grandfather is now part of the cloud of witnesses. Jesus doesn't show up at their graveside, but he does show up in the life that they lived and in the way he calls us to live. Because by imitating them, these faithful ones who have passed on, by living as though they do still surround us with the whole cloud of witnesses, both known and unknown, their faithful lives are called out of the binding of death and into the actions of the living. And we are called from our funeral clothes and ghostliness into the fullness of life in Jesus, which is life abundant. Call it odd, but that gives me hope. Who are the faithful ones who come to your mind? Who are the ones that Jesus calls you to join in his work of reviving, so to speak? Who does Jesus call you to imitate? Whose memory of faith might keep you alive until the great resurrection? I know it's an odd thing to say in church, but since this is supposed to be, or rather, odd thing to say because this is supposed to be a place for the living, but at the same time, I wonder if acknowledging the faithful passed on might still help us in order to live more fully and more faithfully. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that Jesus is calling us to ignore death or pretend that it doesn't exist. The raising of Lazarus does not wipe away the fact that Lazarus died. For example, we are still in a pandemic, and choosing life does not mean that we ditch things that help with public health. But what I am saying is that in our current odd mix of life and death, there are ways in which to choose life. Several years ago, I was talking with a barista at a coffee shop who told me about a scene in a novel that I've not been able to find for myself, but the image still sticks with me. A young boy is captured, and his captors throw him into the family crypt where all the graves are, thinking that they will torment him with the fright that the bones would give him. But what ends up happening is that the boy stands up, and he looks around, and he recognizes that these are the graves of his ancestors. And rather than being terrorized, this boy is comforted, because he's not surrounded by ghosts or things that bring fright, but rather he's surrounded by family. And that is what gives him the strength to push on. When we remember those who are faithful who have passed on in ways that give us life, we join in Jesus in unbinding them from bandages, as it were, however briefly it might be, however temporarily, until the day of resurrection. And we ourselves cast off our funeral clothes in favor of the new robe of life that Jesus calls to. I'll end with this. I heard this morning that at the very end of service at Memorial Road, a woman by the name of Kelly Duncan, I believe, Sherry Duncan, came up and asked for prayers. She has cancer, a couple of months to live. And I'm told by somebody who saw the video of this that at the end there were people coming up to her, of course grieving, but she herself is greeting them with life and life abundantly, because of that hope that she carries.